So I mentioned when we started this series that the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, can be neatly divided into three sections or three parts. There's the diagnosis part, which is chapters 1 through 3, where Paul spends time diagnosing the entire human race. And then there's the deliverance section in chapters 4 through 11, where Paul speaks eloquently and deeply about Jesus, the deliverer, the one who comes to help and to heal and to rescue and to free those who Paul has described in chapters 1 through 3 are in bondage and enslaved. And then beginning in chapter 12, what we find is the description section. From chapters 12 through 16, Paul begins to describe what freedom on the ground of everyday life looks like. For those who have been diagnosed and delivered, this is what life begins to look like. He begins to describe freedom. He begins to map out what a free life looks like and feels like. And he begins his sermon, because that's really what Romans is. As I mentioned in week 1, Paul is stuck. He's not sure he can get to Rome. He desperately wants to get to the churches and to the Christians in Rome. He's stuck. He's not sure he can get there. And just in case he can't get there, he pens a sermon, basically says, this is exactly what I would preach to you if I came. Hopefully I can come and preach this message to you, but just in case I can't, just in case I don't make it, here's my sermon in written form. And he begins his sermon by giving bad news. As I mentioned, chapters 1 through 3, he writes those chapters, he preaches those chapters to demonstrate that no one is good, everyone is guilty. Moral people are guilty, at least people who think they're moral. Immoral people are guilty. Religious people are guilty. Irreligious people are guilty. Good people are guilty. Bad people are guilty. Rule keepers are guilty. Rule breakers are guilty. He levels the playing field in those chapters by showing that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There are no back doors. There are no exits. That every single human being who has lived, is living, and will live comes into this world guilty and condemned, rightly so. And we're supposed to come to the end of chapter 3 and feel desperate and dirty. That's what he wants us to feel. That's what God's law does to us. It breaks us down and shows us who we really are and exposes us. And so Paul intends for us to come to the end of chapter 3 and feel desperate and dirty, because beginning in chapter 4, he moves from the diagnosis section into the deliverance section. And we will never, ever experience the beauty and the weightiness of our deliverance if we don't first feel the weightiness of our desperation. And so Paul preaches a sermon here. And he preaches the law and shows us that we're all guilty. And then he begins to preach the gospel. And he shows how Jesus alone has come to do for guilty, desperate, dirty people like you and me what we could never do for ourselves. And in the course of the deliverance section, which we're almost through with, beginning in chapter 4 and going through chapter 11, beginning in that section, he has introduced some pretty big words. Some huge life-altering ideas. He's introduced us to the word justification, reconciliation, adoption. The last 2 weeks we looked at the big word election. I mean, he's introducing us to these gospel-fueled, God-soaked words that when you begin to unpack, set you free and help you understand just how one way and unilateral God's rescue of people like you and me actually are. And throughout this entire section that we've looked at so far, he's made one point. His point in introducing us to all of these words and all of these big ideas, all of these concepts is singular. His point is this: in Jesus, God has come to do for you what you could never do for yourself. That's what he wants to say. It's what he's trying to beat into us in a variety of different ways. Jesus has freely given to you what you could never get for yourself. God saves bad people because bad people are all that there are. God saves weak and selfish and foolish people because weak and selfish and foolish people are all that there are. He wants us to know that God's rescue is one-sided, single-handed, and total, that God rescues from beginning to end, that those he predestined, he called, and those who he called, he justified, and those who he justified, he glorified. From beginning to end, this rescue is all of grace. It's all of God. Or as Job said back in the Old Testament, salvation is of the Lord, from beginning to end. And Paul wants to make that abundantly clear to all of us by introducing us to these big words. He's not trying to win necessarily a theological war. He's not arguing in the realm of ideas only. He knows that all of these words, justification, reconciliation, adoption, election, have deep existential meaning to us as we live our lives on the ground of everyday life. Well, in this section, he introduces us to another big word, a word that we may hear if we go to church, but it's not a word that we hear a lot out there. It's not a word that we use in our everyday language. The word that he introduces us to here and unpacks is the word righteousness. Righteousness. Not a word that we are terribly familiar with in the workplace or around the dinner table. But righteousness is something, whether you have ever heard that word before, or have ever understood that word before, or if you use that word, righteousness is something that we crave. In fact, righteousness, whether you realize it or not, is something that we not only crave, but pursue. It's something we know we need. It's something that we desperately want. And like justification and all of those other words, the subject of righteousness is not simply a theological issue. It's not. Too oftentimes in church, when we hear these words, we keep them up here, and they remain theological categories and concepts, and they never actually touch down into our lives and do what they are intended to do, which is to liberate us and to set us free and to open our eyes and to remove the guilt and the shame that we feel as we live our lives on a daily basis. You see, believe it or not, whether you know this about yourself or not, the haunting question of all of our lives is, how can I be right? You may have never put it that way. That may be the first time you've ever even considered it. You may be sitting there right now going, I've never asked that question before. That's not the most haunting question in my life. How can I be right? But it is. And I'll show you. I mean, the most haunting question, whether we've ever articulated it this way or not, that plagues us and drives us is, how can I be right? Right with myself, right with the world, right with others, ultimately right with God. What must I do, or who must I become in order to ensure that the ultimate grade on my life is a passing one? Or, to put it negatively, what can I do to guarantee that I won't end up wrong? And I'm not just talking about heaven or hell. I mean, how must I live my life? What kind of decisions do I need to make to avoid wrongness and attain rightness? No one wants to be wrong. No one wants to end up on the wrong side of the fence, the short end of the stick. No one wants to be wrong. We all crave rightness. We need rightness. What must I do? How must I live in order to guarantee that I won't end up wrong? Do I need to stay out of trouble? Do I need to find my soulmate? Do I need to lose weight? Do I need to develop a good reputation? Do I need to parent my children in such a way that they don't end up in prison, or that their girlfriend doesn't get pregnant, or that they stay away from drugs? I mean, what do I have to do? How must I live in order to guarantee that I won't end up wrong? We work hard, all of us do, to escape a failing grade in life by trying to look right, be right, and make sure we get in with the right people so we can end up in the right places. Rightness is something we long for. Rightness is something we crave. So when we talk about righteousness, when Paul talks about righteousness, he's not simply clarifying a theological issue. These are things, and this particularly is a concept that touches down into the deep recesses of our being. He's speaking into our real humanness, how we're wired, the ways that we try to secure for ourselves those things that only God can give. I mean, every one of us want right relationships, right kids, a right career. We want to live our lives right. We want to end our lives right. We don't want to get old and have regrets for pursuing the wrong things, ending up in the wrong places with the wrong people. We have got to get it right. It's the way we feel. It's the way we live. It's the way I feel. We got to get it right. Too many moms live with daily regrets, especially when your children are small, and they're just terrorizing your life. They've invaded everything sacred. They've invaded your sleep. They've invaded your spontaneity. Most people get recklessly out of shape when their children are small. I can't even look at pictures of myself when my children were small. I've burned them all. They invade sacred spaces, sacred spaces. They interrupt our lives. And as a result of interrupting our lives, we end up saying things, thinking things. Maybe you don't say anything. Maybe you just think it. Kim's not going to like this, and I'll be in trouble. But I remember distinctly, we were very young when we had our first child, and we were living far away from home, and Gabe just didn't sleep. He just didn't sleep. And so there was one night, and Kim was nursing, so Kim would get up. There's nothing better for a father than a nursing mother, because there's nothing we can do in the middle of the night. We have to stay in bed, all right? So anyway, Kim was up, and Gabe just wasn't sleeping. We were both sort of ripping our hair out, and I was asleep, and Kim was awake, and we were living in this very, very small place, like 3 o'clock in the morning, and she's, cuddling Gabe and trying to get him to stop crying. He was very colicky, and I woke up to her singing a sweet lullaby, and this is what it said. I'm gonna put you in the oven. I'm gonna put you in the oven. And I woke up immediately. I was like, honey, give me the baby. Give me the baby. Go to sleep. It's fine, What mother, I can tell you, I didn't sing that particular song, but I've said things, I've done things that I wish I hadn't said and wish I hadn't done. Parents are supposed to be nurturing to their children and protective of their children. And even if we are self-controlled enough to not say anything, we think things. I was telling a friend last night, how many of us, even though we love our children, you are a liar if the thought has never crossed your mind, life would be so much easier if I had no children, okay? What kind of thought is that coming from a parent? It's terrible. And so we live with regret. Things that we've said, things that we've done, not just as parents, but as humans. Things that we have left undone. People that we wish we were instead of who we are. We're desperately trying to get it right. We're desperately trying to avoid the wrong. We don't want to live with shame. We don't want to live with guilt. We don't want to live with regret. And we've concluded that the only way to avoid those things is to get it right. To make sure that we get it right. Because as far as we're concerned, life and happiness depend on our getting it right in every way. And if you need proof that this is true, that we desperately crave rightness, here's something that I thought about this morning that exposed, just to test myself, to see if this is really true. Is it true that we crave rightness, that we long for righteousness, that we will do anything and everything to avoid the wrong, to avoid being wrong, to avoid being thought of as wrong. And so I tested this on myself this morning as I was sitting on the couch. And this is what I came up with. Our compulsion, my compulsion, to respond every time I'm criticized is the great revealer of just how much I've built my identity on being right. What happens when you're criticized? You know? Is there not something instinctive inside you that wants to come to your own defense? That wants to show and demonstrate and prove that whatever this person is saying is untrue? That you're not wrong in the way that they're telling you you're wrong? That you're actually right and you're going to prove that you're right? I mean, what is that internal compulsion that wants to desperately demonstrate we're right every time we're criticized? Well, that, for me, is such an exposure of my own heart and how I have built my identity on being right. Well, you're guilty too. We all are of this. We can't escape the desire, the longing to be right, to experience rightness, to avoid wrongness, to be righteous. Well, Paul here in these verses describes two approaches to righteousness, two very clear black and white examples describing two approaches to righteousness. We can either obtain the righteousness we crave by trying to achieve, which he says the Israelites were doing, or by simply receiving it. Those are the two options. We come into this world longing for rightness and righteousness, and our default mode is, I've got to get it. I've got to achieve it. I have to work and labor in order to attain it. That's one way. The other way is by simply receiving it. And he says here that Israel missed it because they were trying to achieve it. They were trying to make themselves right by doing right. And as a result, they completely missed it, he says. They had received God's law, but they had misinterpreted God's law. They saw God's law as a way of saving themselves. It's the way they viewed God's law. They viewed God's law as a means of saving themselves. They've got their rules and they've got their regulations. They've been given a divine to-do list. And if they can just check off the boxes, they'll experience the rightness, avoid the wrongness, and attain the righteousness that they crave. I mean, look at verses 1 through 4. Of chapter 10, he says, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. We've taken that verse so out of context in so many different ways. I mean, we use that verse to say, get smart. You know, Presbyterians love using this verse to say, Pentecostals are bad because they don't know anything. They're just zealous all the time, you know? And we're right because we're smart, you know? We've got it right. We dot our theological I's and we cross our theological T's, and we are intellectually sound. We're not, you know, emotionalistic like these people over here who have zeal but no knowledge. We have knowledge. And that, according to Paul, is what's most important. That's not what's going on here. He's speaking about a particular kind of knowledge. In fact, he's saying that if you are trying to obtain rightness by doing everything right and by becoming the right kind of person, that is zeal without knowledge. You're delusional, you're deceived, you're not even in your right mind because you can't do it. The knowledge that he's talking about here is the knowledge of grace. The knowledge of an alien righteousness, a foreign righteousness that comes our way and is gifted to us minus our merit. That's the knowledge he's talking about. And then he goes on and he says, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So he's describing in those verses one way that we crash and burn by pursuing righteousness. We pursue righteousness, we pursue rightness, we try to get it right, make ourselves right by doing it on our own. Makes that very, very clear. That's zeal without knowledge. That's passion without knowledge. It's activity without knowledge. And he's describing that here, and he says basically the Israelites blew it because they had received God's law. They were the only nation on the planet that received God's law. God came to them and gave them his law. He specially blessed them with his law. He spoke his word of law to them, but they misinterpreted it. Instead of allowing God's law to break them and cause them to crash and burn so that they would look outside of themselves to one who would one day come and keep the law perfectly for them because they were lawbreakers, they actually had a delusional sense of self-image and thought they could pull it off. We can get this righteousness on our own. Thanks for giving us some divine instructions, God. We'll take it from here. Well, we do the same thing. I mean, we maybe don't see God's law as a way of saving ourselves, but we are obsessed with activity and achieving. And everybody I talk to is tired. Everybody I talk to is exhausted. Everybody. People are physically exhausted. People are emotionally exhausted. Relationships are hard because we're broken people living in a broken world with other broken people. Relationships are hard. Even the best of relationships are hard. People are spiritually exhausted, living on that performance treadmill, trying desperately to keep God's favor. People are exhausted. And the reason that we're exhausted isn't because of circumstances outside of us. Regardless of how difficult our circumstances are outside of us, that's not the root cause of our tiredness. The root cause of our tiredness, of our exhaustion, is this internal compulsion to get right on our own. We are obsessed with activity and achievement, and we're tired. We believe that what we do and accomplish determines who we are, that it determines our value. In other words, our default setting is righteousness by working, rightness by achieving, righteousness by becoming. No one has to teach you that. You don't have to be taught that. You come into this world believing that. That's your default setting. That's my default setting. But, and this is what happens, this false hope that we can attain a rightness on our own, that we can make things right, that we can get it right, that we can avoid the wrong, that if we just try hard enough and we just do the right things and avoid the wrong things, then we can find the rightness that we crave, we can find satisfaction and happiness and meaning. This false hope becomes our true burden. The burden that weighs people down throughout life because we have to make things right. We have to do things right. We have to fix ourselves. We have to fix others. We don't even feel the freedom to get it wrong. We don't feel the freedom to be wrong. We're not free. We're enslaved to this pain, this burden of getting it right, of being right. We addictively cling to what slowly kills us, thinking it's what will make us alive. It's what happens. We addictively cling to and continue to pursue what slowly kills us, thinking, believing, concluding that this is what will make us alive. I've told you before that while the law offends us because it tells us what to do, and nobody likes being told what to do, because the law offends us because it tells us what to do, grace offends us even more because it tells us that there's nothing we can do. That's why grace is offensive. It's, you know, was telling a friend the other day, the flesh is just viciously resistant to "it is finished." It's just viciously resistant to "it is finished." I mean, the law annoys us because it tells us what to do. And we might grit our teeth and bear it and do everything we can to do it, but it still annoys us. But there's something even more annoying, even more offensive, and that's grace, because grace tells us that there's nothing we can do. And if there's something we hate more than being told what to do, it's being told that we can't do anything, that we can't earn anything. So when Paul says here, beginning in verse 32 of chapter 9, why did Israel not get the righteousness they craved for? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works, they have stumbled over the stumbling stone. What's he talking about? I mean, and then he goes on and says, as it is written, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. What is that? I mean, what is that stumbling block? What is that offense? Well, it's the exact opposite of what he just described in the verse prior to it. He said, here they are trying to achieve rightness on their own by doing right, being right, and getting it right. Because they're just so terribly offended by the fact that there's nothing they can do, that everything's been done. Grace, in other words, the grace of God that comes our way in the person and finished work of Jesus is a stumbling block. It's offensive. It offends us in the deepest inner parts of our being for the reasons that I just said, because it tells us that there's nothing we can do. And if there's anything we hate more than being told what to do, it's being told that we can't do anything, that we can't earn anything. You see, we are natural-born do-it-yourselfers. We just are. I mean, I've said this before, but the three words that have come to describe much of modern Christianity is not "it is finished," but just do it. I mean, those are the three words. That's sort of the brand. The brand of modern Christianity is just do it. We've lost the three glorious, liberating words, "it is finished," in favor of just do it. We've taken our eyes off of Christ, the author and finisher of our faith, and we have begun to make the focus of the Christian faith all about our lives and what we do. And it shows itself in the ways that I'm describing, trying to achieve rightness, trying to achieve righteousness, trying to get it right, do it right, make it right, become right. We're natural-born do-it-yourselfers, so we wear ourselves out trying to accomplish the impossible. We would rather know what we should do, and yet God frustratingly continues to insist on telling us what He's done. Just tell me what to do. What is it that prompts that question inside of us? Tell us what to do. I mean, just tell us what to do. And yet God is so annoying, to us sinners, because He just continues to frustratingly ignore the question. And He simply tells us what's been done. This isn't about you, what you do. It's your doing that got you into this mess. So just stand down. Relax. This whole thing, this whole enterprise is about what I've done and what I've given to you for free. That's what this is about. Remember in John 6, when the disciples approach Jesus and they're zealous, They have zeal, but not according to knowledge, because they ask Jesus this question. What must we be doing to be doing the works of God? That's the question. What must we be doing to be doing the works of God? Tell us, because we're all about doing the works of God. We just want to know what those are, so tell us, please, what must we be doing to be doing the works of God? And Jesus gives such an unsatisfying answer. I mean, such a lame answer to these guys. He says, do you want to know what you ought to be doing the works of God? Yes. Tell us. We've got our pads out. We've got our pens out. We're ready. You just speak the checklist. We'll write the checklist, and then we'll go do the checklist. Just tell us. And Jesus says, believe in the one whom he has sent. What? How anticlimactic. No. That's not what we asked. That's not what we asked, because what that does is humiliatingly puts us on the sideline. And we want to be quarterbacking the game. You can tell the draft was this weekend. I've got football on my mind. We want to be in the game. We want to be quarterbacking the game. Don't tell us to sit down, shut up, and relax. Who wants to be told to sit down, shut up, and relax? I'm a doer, a fixer, a problem solver. If there's anyone that can make it happen, I can. Moms think this way. Dads think this way. Humans think this way. Husbands think this way. Wives think this way. Children think this way. It's human to think this way. We wear ourselves out trying to accomplish what is impossible to accomplish. That's why we're tired. Desperately spending our lives trying to get for ourselves what only God can give. And that's what Paul says here. He says, guys, it's not our works, it's not our doing, it's not our activity, it's not our accomplishments, but faith in Jesus' works, faith in Jesus' doing, faith in Jesus' activity, faith in Jesus' accomplishments. The rightness that we crave and desperately look for is not a wage that we can earn. It's a gift that we receive. And so he makes it very clear, beginning in verse 30 of chapter 9. The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That makes no sense. How do you attain something you don't pursue? Does that make sense in life anywhere? Attainment is the result of pursuit. You attain good grades, you have to pursue good grades, you attain a good college. You pursue a good career, you attain a good life. You pursue good parenting, you attain good kids. You pursue the right person, you get the right spouse. All of life is about pursuing and then attaining. And here, Paul says something that makes no sense. The counterintuitive reality of God's economy, which makes no sense to us. It's irrational. He says, the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. You go, where in the world do you get something? Where in the world do you get something without pursuing it? Nowhere. There's nowhere in this world that you get something without pursuing it. This is an otherworldly intrusion. It's an otherworldly message. The Gentiles who did not pursue it have attained it. That is a righteousness that is by faith. And then he says in verse 31, but that Israel who pursued it did not succeed in reaching it. Totally backwards. Who do we most naturally resonate with? The Gentiles, over here in the red corner is the Gentiles, okay? They get something by sitting down. And, you've got the Israelites over here in the blue corner. They don't get something, what they crave, and they are incessantly working for it. Who do we resonate with? What method, what MO, mode of operation, do we gravitate toward? The attainment by sitting or the attainment by pursuing? Paul says God's economy makes no sense. Don't even try. That's why I've said before that, the gospel of grace is not simply some app that you add into your old operating system because it doesn't fit. The gospel of grace is a brand new, unconditional operating system. And what God's law does is it dismantles routinely and continuously the old operating system. And what the gospel does is replace the old operating system with a brand new one. And so it doesn't make sense. It requires faith, Paul says, to believe. Remember in Ephesians 2 when Paul's talking about just the radicality of God's one-way love in raising us from death to life? It is by grace you have been saved, and this not from yourselves. It is the gift of God. And I love that verse because he goes on to say how God raises us from the dead. God saves, God rescues, God does all of the freeing work. And then he goes on to say, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And we go, got it. Ha ha. My contribution may be small, but it exists. Okay? For by grace you have been saved. Well, how does that happen? Through faith. There it is. The spotlight is back on me, if even for a split second. I at least contribute faith. And Paul says, I know that you're thinking that, so let me just add a parenthetical statement, but this itself is a gift from God. The faith required to believe is itself a gift from God. You don't even contribute faith. You and I contribute unbelief. That's our contribution, unbelief. God gifts us faith. And when he gifts us and grants us the eyes of faith, we see Jesus. And when we see Jesus, we see a righteousness that was earned by someone else and given to us. The rightness that we crave and long for, that we can only see and attain by the eyes of faith, which itself is a gift from God. God opens our eyes, God causes us to see, God gifts us. When the eyes of faith are opened, we cease our striving. And I'll explain here in a second why we desperately need to hear the gospel over and over and over again. You see, it's a gift of grace that we receive by the gift of faith. Righteousness, the rightness that we crave, is a gift of grace that we received by the gift of faith, which only comes, Paul says, as clear as day from the preaching of the gospel. Notice what he says in verse 17 of chapter 10. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the word of Christ, or the word about Christ. That's where faith comes from. It comes from hearing. So one of the great defenses, one of the great arguments for preaching the gospel over and over and over and over again, not just to people outside the church, but to Christian people inside the church, is because God stokes faith through the preaching of the gospel. And since our faith needs constant stoking because we are perpetually plagued by unbelief, John Calvin said we are partly unbelievers until we die. We're not finished. We're not home yet. We are simul justus et peccator, simultaneously justified and sinner. And because we remain sinners even after God has rescued us, sin is marked first and foremost by unbelief. And so God stokes faith. He reignites faith over and over and over again through the preaching of the gospel. And since our faith needs constant stoking, the preaching of the gospel needs to be constant. So I was reading something by Frederick Buechner yesterday where he says there are all kinds of pressures on the preacher to be all kinds of other things and speak all kinds of other words. That's just the pressure. We think we need to hear another word. We need to hear a different word. We need to hear another word. Paul says there's a word you need to hear over and over and over again. Because the faith that you need to continually see Jesus and the righteousness that he's obtained for you so that you don't spend your life slavishly trying to get it on your own. Okay, the word that you need to open your eyes day in and day out and throughout the day so that you see Jesus when you are weighed down, burdened, feeling guilty and ashamed, broken and burnt out because you're getting it wrong, you're saying it wrong, you're doing it wrong. What do you need to hear in that moment? Do more, try harder. It's like I've said before. I mean, way too much preaching these days is like giving someone who's drowning swimming instructions from the shore. Paddle harder. Come on. It's like telling a one-legged person to hop up and down. I mean, what do we need to hear when you're feeling regret? When you've just said something to your kids that you regret saying, or you've thought something about someone that you regret thinking, and you're feeling guilty and you're feeling ashamed and you wish you hadn't have said it. You wish you hadn't have done it. What do you need to hear in those moments? When life begins to fall apart, you start thinking about your past sins, mistakes that you've made. And as a result of those mistakes, the person you've become. All of us would love to be better than we are. And in those moments when we see we're not what we would want to be, and we're certainly not what we know we should be, what's the word that you need to hear? What is it in those moments that you need to see? You need to see Jesus. And the only thing that enables us to see Jesus is faith. And the only thing that fuels and stokes faith, according to Paul here, is the gospel. We need to be reminded over and over and over and over again that it is finished, over and over again. Because if we're not continually and perpetually reminded that it is finished, we try to finish it. We try to do and do and do, and we act and we act and we act, and we're desperately trying to get it right, do it right, say it right, be right. Because there's nothing we fear more than wrongness. In all of its facets. You see, the gospel fuels faith to believe that all of the righteousness we need and all of the rightness we crave was earned for us and given to us by Jesus. That's what he's saying here. You crave righteousness. You long for rightness. Your life bears witness to the fact that you are continually pursuing rightness and desperately trying to avoid wrongness. Your life proves that. Just look inside your heart, look outside at the way you live, dissect your conversations, think about your relationships. All of life is proof that we're desperately trying to get right and be right. And Paul says there is a righteousness that has come from above, a rightness that has come from above, that you long for, that you need, that you can never attain by doing what the Israelites tried to do, by working, acting, producing, whatever. Jesus alone makes us right with God, right with ourselves. In fact, because Jesus was right for us, we're free to be wrong. And that means that we don't have to get it all right. You're not getting it all right anyway. I'm not either. I mean, it's a pipe dream to think that we're going to get it all right. You and I are wrong. Even in our rightness, there's something about our rightness that's wrong. You know? None of our rightness is pure and undefiled. I mean, we're sinners. We're selfish. You know, we're addicted to self-salvation projects. So even in our rightness, there's something wrong. And so you're not getting it right anyway. Either am I. We're not perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. And so because Jesus was right for us, we're free to be wrong. In other words, I'm not saying go out and pursue wrongness. You're not going to do that anyway. Okay, because you want to be right. Even when you pursue things that are wrong, you're hoping that the payback will be a sense of rightness. So no one's out pursuing wrong. People are pursuing wrong things, but they're hoping that through those wrong things they will establish rightness. So down underneath their pursuit of something wrong, there's this desperate desire to be right, to feel right. And so, I mean, this is what you need to hear. You need to hear that because Jesus was right for you, you're free to be wrong. And that's not to say, go out and do what's wrong. Sin more so that grace may abound. It's not what we're saying. We're saying that you are wrong, you're getting it wrong, and your wrongness is incapable of condemning you. Because Jesus has done for you what you could never do for yourself. So you're free to be wrong. You don't have to get it all right. Moms, hear that. You don't have to get it all right. Our wrongness doesn't need to debilitate us and threaten us because Jesus got it all right for us. So, hearken back to Romans 8:1. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Robert Capon puts it this way, and this is just so beautifully poetic. Jesus takes all of our wrongness down into the forgettery of his death. He takes all of our wrongness down into the forgettery. He just made up that word. I love it though. It's poetic, isn't it? He takes all of our wrongness down into the forgettery of his death. And because of this, our lives are now grounded on and dependent in, not in how right we are or need to be, but in how right Jesus was and continues to be for us. That's your lifeline. Your lifeline is not, I got to get it right. Your lifeline is, he got it right. And there's nothing you need to hear more when you're getting it wrong than that, in my place condemned, he stood and sealed my pardon with his blood. He got it right for me because I could never get it right on my own. So I'll end with this so that all you mothers can go to brunch and eat Belgian waffles, which is my plan. The only hope you have for yourself is to categorically give up hope in yourself. It's the only hope. Give up the pipe dream. Give it up. Give up the pipe dream of trying to get righteousness on your own. Give up the pipe dream of thinking that just around the corner, if I try hard enough, if I try hard enough and I meet the right person, if I get the right job, if I look the right way, if I produce the right kind of children, if I can just keep my secrets to myself, if people don't find me out, blah, 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 then I will be right. I'll experience rightness, which is what I crave. Give the pipe dream up. Just give it up. Because that's exactly what it is. It's a pipe dream. Just give it up. Throw in the towel. Throw it in. Just throw it in. Okay? You'll be lighter because you'll all be walking out of here without the towels that you carried in. Just throw it in. Okay? Throw it in. Throw it in the middle. Throw it in the aisle. Throw it. Just throw in the towel. Because the only hope, according to Paul, according to God, that you have for yourself is to categorically give up hope in yourself. And that's not a bad word. That's a good word. There are preachers, sort of prosperity, self-help preachers who would say, well, you can't say that because then people will develop a bad self-image. If you have a good self-image, it's because you're deceived. Okay? So I'm trying to help you with your realistic bad self-image. Okay, if you've got a good self-image, it's not because you're pulling it off. It's because you're constantly telling yourself, I'm good enough, I'm strong enough, and doggone it, people like me, okay, like Stuart Smalley. All right? I mean, you're looking at yourself in the mirror going, I can do it, I can do it. I mean, just give up the pipe dream. The only hope you have for yourself is to give up hope in yourself and see with the eyes of faith the one who came to grant you, give you righteousness that you could never get and establish your heart in a rightness that you could never attain. Let's pray together.